People are not actually up to save this version of democracy. To a lot of Americans, this version of democracy sucks. This is a moment where a lot of Democrats want the Democratic Party to be fighting harder. They don't see the kind of fight that they think is necessary at this moment. AI has the potential to fundamentally transform human existence and to potentially destroy the foundation of our economy.
These are people in active relationships who, on the side, are getting their regular hits of dopamine or companionship, not even from like a dedicated AI partner, but from ChatGPT.
He's engaged in the most brazen acts of corruption in the history of the country, right? The meme coin alone is the most corrupt thing a president has ever done. And yet the country is kind of willing to look the other way. There is an expiration stamp on this version of democracy. It will disappear at some point, and we should just make sure that it doesn't disappear on our watch.
Senator Murphy, welcome to the People's Cabinet.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We have a lot to get to today, but I have the most important question first. Yeah. It's about the border.
Yeah.
And it's the border between Red Sox Nation and Yankees. I don't even know what Yankees fans call it because I'm a Red Sox fan. Where is the border?
So the border runs through central Connecticut. Meriden, Connecticut would kind of be ground zero, where you probably got equal numbers of Patriots and Giants fans, equal numbers of Red Sox, Yankees fans. Now you can actually track it pretty accurately because if you look at social media mentions and you geocode it, you can actually draw the line. And so it's kind of a funny line, but it is about a 50-50 state. It's, generally we're like about 40% Red Sox fans, 40% Yankees fans, and then the Mets have 5% and then 5% for others. So, I have the great benefit of, I grew up rooting for whoever my dad rooted for. And when my dad was younger, he rooted for the Red Sox and the Celtics. But because the Patriots didn't exist when he was younger, he was a New York Giants fan.
Okay.
So I have, both New York and Boston allegiances.
That's kind of the best of both. Do you think we should have traded Devers?
Well, at first I thought it was a disaster. It felt like the Mookie Betts trade again. But then the more you learn about, how defiant he was being in the clubhouse, he was always a bit of an odd duck, it seemed. And then you look at the 10-game winning streak and you think to yourself, well, maybe they saw something that we didn't. I think we'll probably listen. They handled the whole situation badly. Like they shouldn't have brought in Bregman without really working it through with Devers ahead of time. So I still blame the ownership for the problem that they created, but maybe they solved it the best way they could.
There might be something there. Well, there's a lesson in teamwork there, and there's to be determined. It seems a lesson Democratic Party in teamwork when we move forward.
Good transition.
Thank you. I'm trying.
Yeah.
28% or so is the approval rating of Democrats. It's not unfamiliar to you. You've been very outspoken both in the policies in which the Democrats should espouse and the channels in which they espouse them. I just want to get into with you your perspective on where we are today and how we should move forward. And let's start maybe with the policy and positioning perspective.
Well, I just say a word about that 28% approval rating. I remember when we were passing the Affordable Care Act, and it was pretty unpopular. It was as it was moving through the process, and there were a lot of Democrats who opposed the Affordable Care Act. But if you scratch below the numbers, you found out that a lot of those Democrats opposed it because they, wanted to go further, right? That they wanted a single-payer system, and so they were happy to have this rather than the status quo. But it's not always that people, think that, you're entirely on the wrong page. You're just not matched exactly with their alignment on issues. And listen, this is a moment where a lot of Democrats want the Democratic Party to be fighting harder, and they don't see the kind of fight that they think is necessary at this moment. In order to save a democracy, you have got to engage in a lot of risk-tolerant behavior. You got to be willing to take risks. And we're asking people to take risks, activists, college presidents, journalists, lawyers. So we have to be willing to take risks as the leaders of the Democratic Party in the way that, we show up in shutdown fights, in legislative fights. If we show a willingness to be edgy and more confrontational, I think, people out there that we're asking to sacrifice for our democracy will be willing to do the same thing.
Where do you think we've done that, and where do you think there are opportunities for more fight?
Well, listen, I don't like the way that we approached the last appropriations bills. Obviously, we ended up passing a continuing resolution that was written by Republicans right at a moment that the president was engaging in the early stages of this massive illegality. We're going to have an opportunity in a few months to confront that same question again. Do we sign off on, another Republican budget that does nothing to either address the ways that the president is acting illegally, his campaign to destroy our democracy, or the ways that he's just hurting average Americans, refusing to spend money on education or disaster assistance, or throwing millions of people off of healthcare? I think people want us to show a fight at that moment, and I hope that we will.
One of the areas is just broken in the news that Speaker Johnson is recessing the House over the Epstein files. I think there's a lot of actually positive reception of what the Democrats have been doing on that. What's your opinion on how Speaker Johnson has proceeded as a former member of the House? And what is your opinion on how Democrats need to move forward on this issue?
Well, listen, I think the most important thing that's happening right now is that Donald Trump's own base is exposing him, as a charlatan. And so I think at this moment, it's probably important for that phenomenon to play out. If it immediately becomes just another political football, it may be that his own supporters are going to be less willing to come to this recognition, this realization that he sold them a bill of goods. I think for Democrats, it's important to still talk about it, but to put it in some context. My friend Dan Pfeiffer made this point really well, that we should talk about this as just another example of Donald Trump getting up every day with one single purpose in mind: to protect himself and his other rich friends, right? That's the entire MO of this White House. How do the levers of government power be used to benefit the very, very wealthy, the elites, in particular those that are connected to the president personally? Whatever is in those files, whether it's embarrassing to him or embarrassing to other friends of his, it's just another example of him being willing to do whatever it takes, paper over the truth, screw poor people, in order to help out his Mar-a-Lago buddies.
It's a larger point that I know that you've been very vocal about, which is this culture of corruption that Trump is espousing. I feel like he's trying to psychologically condition the population to think that whatever he is doing is okay, and then he continues to raise the bar. Candidly, I think the media also gives him a pass on all of those things. But we're reaching a point now where Democrats are fighting back, as you mentioned, and there's something that I think is interesting about that, which is there's this whole culture that I think we are still trying to grapple with from 2024, which is, we talked a lot about saving democracy being at risk, but there's a lot of people out there who don't really feel like democracy was working for them in the first place, right? I was recently vocal about the corruption. I got a lot of things in my DMs being like, systems never worked for me, so I don't believe in it, right? What is your thoughts on that, and how do we get people to believe in the system again when both the president is doing things that are blatantly corrupt, but a lot of people don't feel like, no disrespect, elected officials are being ethical either?
No, I agree with your thesis 100%. I don't have a lot of critiques of Kamala Harris's campaign because I think she was put in a very difficult position. I think she ran a very good campaign given the very short calendar that she was handed. But to the extent that I have one, it was this, I think, inability to understand that people are not actually up to save this version of democracy, right? To a lot of Americans, this version of democracy sucks. It's been used to reward elites and hurt regular people. And the norms to them are not worth preserving. They're worth throwing out if that's what's necessary in order to help them. That means the only way the Democratic Party is going to save democracy is for us to be just as focused on unrigging the democracy as we are on unrigging the economy. If you ran a campaign on those two things, unrig the economy so that elites don't control your life, that you have a shot at economic success, and unrigging the democracy so that the elites don't run it, the powerful and the lobbyists and the PACs don't run it, regular people run it, there'd be a lot of people, including many in Trump's coalition, who are willing to listen. And I'll drill down a little bit deeper in the critique of our party. When I came to Congress 20 years ago, the Democrats' approach to democracy reform was campaign finance reform. We spent a lot of time talking about the public financing of elections, getting dark money, big money out of politics. In the 20 years that I've been in Congress, our democracy reform agenda has transitioned from big money in politics to voting rights. Now, voting rights is a really important issue, but it's not a broadcast message, right? The issue of voting rights does not animate the entirety of the country from left to right. getting big money out of politics does. It's an apolitical issue. It allows you to go into his coalition, and it allows you to say, listen, if you vote us in, we're going to protect democracy, but we're going to reform it, and we're going to put you back in charge. So we've got to find a way to kind of get back to our 21st century roots as a party that talked very loudly and urgently about the need for massive campaign and ethics reform.
There's also a lot of conversation about the kitchen table issues, right, in the economy. It seems like Democrats have struggled, especially recently, on how to best communicate that. Donald Trump has this kind of generalized message like, you're getting screwed and I'm going to help you. How do you think the Democrats need to move forward on specific policy issues around the economy and people's affordability issues?
Well, be confrontational. I mean, ultimately, you have to tell a political narrative, and that narrative has to involve, both an explanation on how you're going to help people, but also an explanation as to who's screwing them. Whether you like it or not, right? Hero and villain stories, they are our lifeblood, right? That's how politics works. That's how children's theater works. It's how the movies we love work, and so it's practical politics, but it also is just true that there are some very powerful interests out there, from the private equity firms that are ruining our healthcare system to the drug industry that are price gouging consumers to the investors that are buying up huge swaths of housing and jacking up the prices. We can tell an accurate story about who has power, who's using that power to screw consumers, and how if you put us in charge, we are going to take power from the people who are hurting you, and we're going to deliver it back to you. But our party over the years has been a little, hesitant to get involved in, that kind of pugilistic confrontational politics. We look at somebody like Bernie and think of him as some threat to the party because he engages in that kind of confrontational rhetoric with power. I just, I don't think there's any way to win unless we are both talking about solutions, but also talking about who's doing the screwing and who we're ultimately going to take power from.
What is your opinion on, you're seeing new candidates emerge specifically around these issues, around affordability? Zohran Mamdani in New York is the latest example. What are your thoughts on that election, and where is the message around affordability and populism, lessons that others can learn from potentially that election or others that you've seen?
Yeah, listen, I don't agree with everything that he says, but we absolutely should, learn a lesson from his laser-like focus on not just economics and affordability, but big, easy to understand ideas, right? That's Republicans have always had that going for them, right? Less regulation, lower taxes, build a wall. What was our message on prescription drugs? Our message on prescription drugs was that we were going to use the bulk purchasing power of the Medicare program to lower prices for the top 10 drugs, use those savings in order to cap the out-of-pocket costs for right. You're lost. You're
lost
gone.
Me 5 seconds
You're gone.
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
No, we're gonna cap the price of every single prescription drug in this country. We're gonna tell drug companies that you can make a little bit of profit, but you're not gonna gouge us. Every single drug, right? So Mamdani tells us, be focused on cost, on economics. But also, put some big ideas out there. He's got some big ideas. They're controversial ideas, but it shows people that he's serious and that he understands the gravity of the problem because he's offering solutions that seem big enough to solve the problem.
You touched on something just there in that example of the phraseology, so to speak, in communications around capping drug costs. How are you thinking about it? Because you've been one of the leaders in communications, not just in what you're saying, but where you're saying it, right? And we've seen, podcasting starting to become more mainstream in the Democratic Party. Candidly, I'm obviously biased, but way behind where Republicans were. You're seeing independent media like Midas Touch, Brian Tyler Cohen, David Pakman, in many ways out trafficking some of the more linear networks. You seem to be everywhere, and you seem to be effectively communicating on different channels. Where did that come from for you, and what is your theory of the case?
Well, I mean, listen, whether we like it or not, we live in a really diffuse media environment in which you can no longer, check the box by going on MSNBC a couple times a week. Frankly, I go on those shows in part to repackage those interviews to be able to talk to more people on social media. So I just think we have to understand sort of where the audience is today. We have to be willing to go on shows that aren't as safe, right? Shows that are run by comedians, shows that are coded, center right or right. And then we just need to not be afraid of our authentic selves. In this business, we are so used to vetting all of our communications through very talented communications professionals that we lose track of the fact that these days voters are smart enough to notice when it's vetted or poll tested versus when it's actually you. And so we've just got to be willing to make more mistakes rhetorically. The other thing we have to do as a movement is recognize that we have a political consultancy in the Democratic Party that has led us astray by telling us that every 2 years we have to plow all of our money into 30-second ads that disappear instead of the kind of progressive infrastructure on the media side and on the mobilization side that remains. We seem to have this conversation every 4 years. Oh, wait a second, we've got to build progressive media. But then we never do it because those consultants don't get paid when you send money to some of the outlets that you were naming. They only get paid when you cut and place the 30-second ad. So we've got to confront that consultancy sooner rather than later.
On the new technology front related to, the platforms, TikTok, Facebook, et cetera, there's obviously a lot that has to do with people's consumption, but then also their feelings of isolation that come with social media. I know that you've been very outspoken about this epidemic of loneliness. I'm curious on how you see this all blend together, and for our listeners, what you're doing about it and where we need to proceed, especially with technology moving so fast.
Well, I think it's important for us to confront Trump head on, but to also be willing to use him as a mirror for society and culture. How do we get to the point where he's engaged in the most brazen acts of corruption in the history of the country, right? The meme coin alone is the most corrupt thing a president has ever done. And yet the country is kind of willing to look the other way. Now, part of that is a story about a different set of rules having always applied to Donald Trump than anybody else. But it's also a story of how the fabric of our communities has been frayed so badly that we feel very little moral and ethical obligation to each other any longer. We live in a world today in which you are told to just take care of yourself, that your job in life is to build your pile. And you know what? The way you get there, I'm not going to judge you for it because all that matters in the end is, did you take care of yourself? We've lost these values of restraint and modesty and selflessness that we used to be much better about being true to 50 or 60 years ago. And it leads to a moment like today where we just look the other way when Donald Trump uses illicit, illegal means to increase his pile because we've lost this sense of connection to community. So for me, the project ahead of us is enormous because, yes, in the short term, it's about beating Donald Trump politically, but it's also about saying, okay, how can we create an economy, a culture, a government that incentivizes us to wake up every day and care a little bit more about our neighbors and a little bit less about ourselves? That's the levers to impact that are not all government levers, but there are plenty of them. There are plenty of mistakes that we made that led to these increasing lives of isolation that are being led by adults and kids. And there are plenty of choices we can make in the future, especially when it comes to AI, that could help stitch the country back together.
You talked on AI, and this is still kind of on a simmer and not a boil yet. But there's been articles written in the New York Times, I think recently, had an article about how many people are using AI bots because they feel so lonely, right? These are people in active relationships who on the side are getting their regular hits of dopamine or what have you, or companionship, not even from like a dedicated AI partner, but from ChatGPT.
Two-thirds of teens today are using chatbots as a replacement for in-person friendship. So
how do we be thoughtful about that? Because obviously this is a concern. There is obviously an argument, well, you don't want to curb technology and technology use is good, et cetera. How do you think about how we approach this in this era of technology as a frontier with AI in a way that probably hasn't been like this since the internet first came about?
Well, a couple things to say. First, this might be the most important thing that's happening in the country today. Donald Trump may be the second most important thing happening. AI has the potential to fundamentally transform human existence and to potentially destroy the foundation of our economy. There is a world in which, in the next 10 years, AI replaces millions of jobs, and that the disruption happens so quickly that it could lead to economic collapse. There's also the potential for real spiritual disintegration, as almost overnight, these core human functions like friendship, companionship, but also creativity, composition, get outsourced to robots, it's much more disruptive than the Industrial Revolution. That was the replacement of your physical outputs by a machine. This is the replacement of your mental outputs, your brain function by machines. It's not true that we have ever looked at technology and said, maybe we shouldn't curb it. In fact, every single new breakthrough technology that has been commercialized in the last 100 years was met with fierce regulation, right? Whether it be advanced medicine or the telephone or nuclear technology, we said, no, we see the way that this could go very, very wrong if we don't put some controls on it, and we did. And for some reason, we've just stopped. AI could be more disruptive than the telephone, the nuclear energy, or advanced medicine. And the idea that we are not going to say to these companies who are offering friendship substitutes for our children that there shouldn't be some guardrails on what these AIs can say, can talk about, it's just insane. And it violates sort of the entire history of the interaction of government and the economy in the American experiment.
What's your perspective on Trump's recent announcement, or I would say it's David Sachs more specifically, that they're going to start regulating, quote, woke AI?
Well, I mean, obviously what they're talking about is, trying to prompt AI to only spout the regime line. When they say woke, they mean that they don't, want AI to believe in human rights, in civil rights, in broad shared prosperity. Elon Musk, was confronted with his AI essentially parroting and endorsing Hitler. And so he fixed it. But go on Grok and see what it says today. It's not any better.
Yeah, there's a lot of that shit.
No, there's a lot of crazy fascism. Like if you, somebody went on and said, who should I vote for in the German elections? And his new improved AI said, you should definitely vote for the neo-Nazi party, right? So so according to them, that's not a woke AI because it's representing the most anti-woke party out there, the neo-Nazi party. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to bully these private companies into building AIs with a fiercely conservative, at best, and at worst, fiercely xenophobic, misogynist, racist code underlying it.
And what can we do about that? Because one would think with the amount of power they have, with the wealth that they have, that they would try to do what's best for their business at the very least and not what Trump wants. But it seems like from the very beginning, everything from their donations to his inauguration committee to standing in the literal front row in support, they seem to be just capitulating left and right. So where do you think it ends, and what can a listener do to fight back who are gravely concerned about this?
Well, listen, the first thing that we need to do when we're confronting a new technology like this is to try to approach it in a bipartisan way because I don't think there'll be a lot of trust out there if only Democrats join together to regulate AI or only Republicans join together. So there is a bipartisan bill in the Senate right now. My colleague from Connecticut, Dick Blumenthal, Josh Hawley, super conservative from Missouri, on a new regulatory framework to sort of ask basic questions when new technologies are coming online. How many jobs are they going to displace? What's the impact on our kids? Is it really easy for foreign actors to be able to manipulate the new AI? So I just think if we sort of decide together, Republicans and Democrats, that we're going to do this in a bipartisan way, it'll add some important legitimacy to the debate.
An issue that I know is very passionate for you and obviously affected your state deeply is gun control, and you've been out very vocally on it. You were able to pass historic gun control when President Biden was there. Can you let people know where you would like to go with this, especially under President Trump, and what people can do locally? Because everyone, I think, continues to be incredibly angry about the lack of progress, despite the progress that you have made.
Well, I guess what I think is important to communicate right now is that we have made progress. That for 30 years we didn't pass anything to make our communities safer. The gun lobby ran Washington. And then in 2022, we passed the first bill in 3 decades that regulates guns and puts a lot of money into mental health and school safety and community anti-gun violence initiatives. And not coincidentally, immediately after we passed that bill, gun violence rates began to plummet in this country. In fact, we've never seen a 2-year decline in gun violence rates like we saw in 2023 and 2024. And so, yes, this is an issue where people feel powerless, in which they feel like nothing's happening. But I want people to know we passed a really important bill. We got immediate results, and we kind of now have proof of concept that if you change the gun laws, even in relatively small ways, you can get enormous immediate payoff. And hopefully that actually gives confidence to activists or would-be activists out in the country to join the movement, because we've seen, even when we didn't get everything we wanted in the 2022 gun bill, that it led to a lot of lives being saved.
The fact that you got something done there was historic. And
Yeah,
I think you deserve a lot of credit for
Credit to Republicans for stepping up at that moment.
Last question for you. There's still a lot of disaffected voters out there. I think people are still stunned from 2024, the outcome of the election. I think there's a lot of people who voted for President Trump who are regretting their vote. There are a lot of people who are still very passionate about President Trump who I think just feel like government's not working for them. One of the things we ask every guest on this program is, what is your advice to listeners who are going out to their communities and want to reactivate those people to get them excited about government again and get excited in engaging their communities again?
Well, the history of fascist takeovers involves convincing voters that it's hopeless, that your voice doesn't matter, or that, the risk of getting involved is just too big, too high, and so you should stay indoors. I want people to understand that, the American democracy sticking around for another 50 years, another 10 years, another 5 years is not inevitable. There is an expiration stamp on this version of democracy. It will disappear at some point, and we should just make sure that it doesn't disappear on our watch. There's a wonderful study out of Harvard that I think is right that shows when 3% of a population in a particular place rises up to protest corruption, to protest the destruction of democracy or democratic norms, they are almost always successful. There's some magic to that level of popular mobilization. And so just have confidence that if you decide to be part of this moment, no matter how hopeless he tries to make you feel, history judges mass popular mobilization as always being successful in protecting things that we revere and we love. And we love American democracy. It's worth fighting for.
Senator Murphy, thank you for coming on the People's Cabinet.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Cabinet. If you did, please like, subscribe, ring that bell, and put in the comments below who else you'd like to see sworn in. And stay tuned for new episodes every Tuesday. Let's go.